Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Amanda Graham. I am the academic director at the Irving Institute for Energy and Society at Dartmouth College, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you today for our Dartmouth Energy Collaborative Lunch Seminar. Lunch is BYO lunch today, and we are really delighted to have Wändi Bruine de Bruin from the University of Southern California with us today. Her talk title is What Psychology and Behavioral Science Tell Us About Improving Climate and Energy Communications. And I just want to tell you a little bit about Wändi before she gets started. Wändi just moved over the pond, just from over the Atlantic from Leeds University this past year to start at the University of Southern California. Her master's and PhD are both from Carnegie Mellon in behavioral design research and psychology, and she has a second master's and a BS in psychology and cognitive psychology from the Free University in the Netherlands. She has held numerous visiting researcher appointments, including at RAND, the Santa Fe Institute, Dutch Central Bank, and the Federal Reserve Bank. And notably, with colleagues at the Center for Economic and Social Research at USC, she's running a national longitudinal survey to track symptoms, risk perceptions, protective behaviors, food insecurity, and political polarization during the COVID-19 pandemic. And she's also on the team that's running the 2020 election tracking poll, which is the Daybreak poll. And one of the most interesting things that I found when I was taking a look at Wändi's background was that she grew up on a flower farm in the Netherlands. But all of that is great context for her contribution in our fall series on energy and the election. She won't speak specifically about the election unless we really pressure her, right? But she's going to be talking about climate and energy communications and how we can think differently about it from the standpoints of psychology and behavioral science, which are so critically important and often really overlooked. So I'm really thrilled to welcome Wändi here to give a talk to us today. So Wändi, please take it away.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to give a presentation to you from my couch. I wish I could be there in person. Let me share my screen. Today I'm going to talk about what psychology and behavioral science tell us about improving climate and energy communication. If you have any questions though about the work on COVID-19, elections, or growing up on a flower farm, I'm happy to answer those questions at the end. But please feel free to interrupt with clarifying questions.
And throw them into the Q&A. Thank you for that, for giving me that reminder, Wändi. Throw them into the Q&A if you have any questions. Great, thank you.
I moved to the University of California in January. I've spent more time at home than on campus, unfortunately, due to the pandemic. But I am building connections across USC. I am leading a behavioral science and well-being policy collaboration that brings together psychologists and behavioral scientists from across USC who aim to improve communications and interventions to inform people's decisions about risk. And that includes risks related to climate and energy, but also financial risk and health risk. Because that work is very interdisciplinary, I have a large list of other affiliations across USC that represent those topics, as you can see on this slide. So when I'm trying to progress my slides, that works. Okay, so when I say that my work aims to inform communications to help people make decisions about various risks, the types of communications I'm talking about are communications that might be released by practitioners, policymakers, scientists, various organizations to help people, to provide people with information and to inform risks, decisions about risks. Those communications might include public reports, brochures, websites, and videos, where the information is designed and then shared with large audiences. So you better get it right before you disseminate that information. Otherwise, you might be wasting a lot of time and energy, and also that of your recipients, the time of your recipients. So the goal of communications that I design and that those groups tend to disseminate It's to improve public understanding, to inform decisions, and sometimes also to motivate behavior change if there is a recommended behavior. Now, unfortunately, many communications that are being designed are not necessarily effective. So there are communication problems that I see commonly, whether those communications that I'm working on are focused on health, climate, or finances. There are communication problems that tend to cut across the board. And here is a list that I'll be talking about. All of my examples will be focused on climate and energy communication, but actually a lot of those communication issues arise across topics. So let me go through them one by one. So a common communication problem that I see is that communications that are being developed by experts in a particular domain tend to violate readability guidelines. So you may or may not be aware that the readability guidelines that are out there for public communications state that they should be readable to a reader who can read at the 6th to 8th grade level. And I apologize, this slide says that still UK grade level, but it's actually the US grade level that I've adapted this to. So communication should be written in simple wording that can be understandable to people who read at the 6th to 8th grade level, because in the general population, reading comprehension skills vary quite a bit. But even for skilled readers, text will be easier to comprehend if it's written in simple wording. You know, the topics that we write about are complex enough. If we also write about them in difficult wording, it will be harder for people to process. So generally, the guideline is to use words that are 3 syllables or less, because those are the words that are easier to read. They're shorter, but those also tend to be the words that are more commonly used in the language. So they're easier for people to understand and process. So if you use longer words, that can be difficult for people to understand, and those longer words usually have synonyms that might be better for public communications. So as an example, the Guardian has a grade level of 6, and the Guardian is a newspaper in the UK that actually has quite an educated audience. So the Guardian understands that writing at the 6th grade reading level is beneficial for you know, the understandability of their newspaper. But if you look, for example, at what climate communications are doing, they are not quite following the readability guidelines. So for example, the UK Climate Projections Briefing Report, which is a report that is being produced every couple of years by the UK Met Office to inform people about projected climate change for the UK, is written at grade level 16.8. And again, these are US grade levels. So you need to be quite educated to understand the UK Climate Projections Briefing Report. And so perhaps that report would be easier to understand and use for a wider variety of audiences if it was written at a simpler level. And I haven't checked the readability level of IPCC reports, but my guess is it will be equally difficult to read those. And again, this is important because according to the OECD, only 10% of UK adults would be comfortable reading the UK Climate Projection Report. So that really should be simplified. Currently, I am in the US, so I'm continuing this kind of work in the US. And I've started to work with the United Nations to look at words that are commonly used in climate reports, including by the IPCC, such as mitigation, adaptation, sustainability, carbon dioxide removal, and so on. And so we're doing interviews with members of the US public who are in those interviews being asked to interpret the terms and to tell us what they think they mean. And it's too early to share all the findings, but one thing that I can tell you is that mitigation is still not a widely recognized word, and people tend to confuse mitigation and adaptation, two key terms that are central to climate communications. So perhaps it's a good idea to start thinking of simpler ways to express those important terms for climate communications. A second communication problem that I often come across, and that is especially true in climate communications, but I've also seen it in other contexts, is that there's a focus on audiences who don't believe climate change is happening, and not so much on the people who are actually concerned about climate change and who are motivated to do something about it. But just because someone is convinced that climate change is happening, and just because they are motivated to do something about it, doesn't necessarily mean that they know what to do or are doing the right things. So, as you may have heard, according to the Yale Climate Communication group, 73% of people in the US now believe that climate change is happening. So this is a majority that thinks that climate change is real. However, I have found both in the US and the UK that people who self-identify as pro-environmental or green, they do not necessarily know how to best reduce the carbon footprint in their home. So we've done nationally representative surveys in the US where we asked people, what are the best things you can do in your home to save, to reduce your carbon footprint? And the most common response by far tends to be turn off the lights. And even though it's a good idea to turn off the lights and it will reduce your carbon footprint, it is not the most effective thing you can do in your home to reduce your carbon footprint. And so one thing that, depending on where you live, but in a lot of places in the US, one thing that people could do to save electricity by and their carbon footprint by a lot is to reduce the use of their air conditioner. But that was not a common answer. And similarly, in the UK, we've done work where we ask people what they can do to to lower the carbon footprint of their food choices. And there too, we find that even self-identified green consumers do not necessarily know the best way to reduce the carbon footprint of their food choices. So, which is one of the best things you can do to reduce the carbon footprint of your food choices is to eat less meat. And that was not at all a common response to that question, suggesting that perhaps we should try to focus on that motivated majority and help them to figure out how to reduce their carbon footprint. A third issue that I've noticed in climate communications is that communications are not necessarily targeting local concerns. So a lot of climate communications are focused on warning about increasing temperatures. And in fact, climate change used to be referred to as global warming. Now, it turns out, this is also work in the UK, that we found that in the UK, the idea of global warming tended to get, on average, quite positive responses from people in the UK, even from people who are concerned about climate change. If you've been to the UK, then you know that the weather can be quite dreadful. Even in the summer, the skies can be gray and it can be rainy, and people don't like that, or most people don't like that. And so if you ask about global warming and increasing temperatures, people in the UK, many of them tend to have positive responses to that. They like the idea of having warmer weather, especially in the summer. But it's not the case that people in the UK don't worry about climate change. They do, but their concerns about climate change are related to concerns about heavy rainfall and flooding. So suggesting that if you want to communicate with people in the UK about climate change, it's important to focus on extreme weather related to rainfall and flooding, and because that will likely motivate people to do something about it. And so similarly, in other places in the world, there may be different concerns about what climate change will bring to their area, and it's important to focus on what those consequences for those areas will be to motivate the people in those areas. A fourth communication problem that I've come across is that communication designers tend to focus on pushing one alternative for solving the climate problem rather than offering a range of options. And so an example I want to give here is from a project on carbon capture and storage that I worked on when I was at Carnegie Mellon University, where I got my PhD, but also spent on the faculty for 10 years in the Department of Engineering and Public Policy. And we worked on a project on carbon capture and storage, and I was asked by the engineers at Carnegie Mellon's Department of Engineering and Public Policy to join their project because they realized that carbon capture and storage might not be implemented to try to curb carbon emissions if there was public resistance against it. And so they figured they should get a psychologist on board who would be able to help them to communicate better. And so they asked me. And we started by doing interviews and surveys with members of the general public to ask about carbon capture and storage. And this was in 2004. And our interviewees and survey respondents pretty much had the same response that I had at the time. And that is they had never heard of carbon capture and storage. And actually, even to this day, I find that when I talk about carbon capture and storage, large parts of my audiences have never heard about it. So if you are also puzzled about what it is, let me give you my lay explanation of what it is. So carbon capture and storage basically is a technology that is meant to be added to electricity generation, coal-fired electricity generation plants to take out the carbon dioxide. So instead of releasing the carbon dioxide into the atmosphere where it can contribute to climate change, it's put deep underground. And so we had to give that kind of explanation to our interviewees and survey respondents as well, because they hadn't heard about it. And then we found that the more we try to explain about carbon capture and storage and how it works, and even if we try to be as neutral as possible in our explanations, we found that people didn't like it. And it reminded them of nuclear waste, where you put things in the environment that don't belong there. And so they did not like the idea of it, and they focused on the negatives and the risks of this technology, and basically did not like it the more we told them about it. And they also asked us to talk about other technologies instead. So they asked, well, what about using solar instead, or wind energy? So then in the next step of that project, we decided to give people the information that they asked for in a systematic manner. So I realize this is not readable, but what I want to show you is that we showed people information about a wide range of technologies. This is not even all of them. And for every technology, we systematically showed the same information. So information about availability, reliability, limits, and safety, and so on. And this reflected information that experts of those technologies wanted to share, but also information that lay audiences had asked us about. So these information sheets facilitated systematic comparisons between technologies. And a little bit to my surprise, what we found is that when we presented alternatives to carbon capture and storage, so other low carbon electricity technologies that might also be possible, people were less negative about carbon capture and storage. And I think this happened because when you look at a range of technologies it becomes easier to see that all technologies have risks. And and you have to accept some of that risk to get the benefits of having low carbon electricity generation. And so people were willing to include some CCS as part of low carbon electricity technologies. Sorry, as part of a low carbon electricity generation portfolio. So a portfolio that uses a range of technologies. They tended to include some CCS in that as well. So presenting the alternative, pushing an alternative may not be a good idea. Presenting the alternatives and their risks and benefits may make people realize that there are risks to all of the technologies, and maybe accepting some risk is okay, including some risks related to CCS. Then the fifth issue that I've come across is that communication designers do not always understand what motivates people to change their behavior. And so they focus on the wrong motivations. Here's an example. So if you look at electricity saving programs that are being promoted by electricity providers, you tend to see that those advertisements and brochures tend to focus on the idea that saving energy saves you money. And that's of course true. Saving energy will save you money, perhaps not a whole lot, but it will save you some. And this is commonly emphasized in programs that promote energy savings. But, oh, let me go back to that. So, but one thing I want to highlight is that actually research in psychology suggests that there are some behaviors that people are intrinsically motivated to do. And those that may, for example, be donating blood or recycling. And it turns out that some studies have suggested that if you start paying people for behaviors that they would have wanted to engage in anyway, that can undermine their willingness to engage in those behaviors. Because if you offer money for things that people do to do good, then the act of offering the money makes people feel that they're doing it for the money. So it basically undermines the warm glow that they would have felt if they had done it for free. And so this has been shown in the context of blood donations and recycling. And we thought that this may also happen in the context of energy savings, where we had found in our interviews that there are a lot of consumers who save energy because they want to do something good for the environment. And so they're actually families that are quite proud that they're not turning on the heat when it's getting cold, or not blasting the air conditioner when it's getting hot, because they want to do something good. And so we were concerned that advertising that saving energy will save you money would undermine that warm glow of doing something good when you save energy. And note that this context is a little different, because the studies I discussed that were done in psychology actually offered people money for doing something good, for recycling or giving blood. But in this particular context, in the context of advertising energy saving programs, it's always true that saving energy will save you money, even if it's whether or not it's emphasized in those advertisements, right? So people are not receiving extra money. It's intrinsic in saving energy that you will save money. So to test that idea that maybe emphasizing the money is not that motivating, we tested 3 advertisements that went out to electricity consumers of an electricity provider that we worked with. And the 3, I'm just giving you little blurbs out of the advertisements. The first advertisement to which people were randomly assigned emphasized only the monetary benefits. So it said, we are offering a new program that will help you to save money. By using less electricity, you can reduce your electricity bill. Then the second advertisement emphasized the environmental impact, or the environmental benefits of saving electricity. So it said, we are offering a new program that will help you to save energy. So same wording, but then it emphasized, by using less electricity, you can reduce your environmental impact. And then in the third advertisement, we emphasized both, because whenever I talked about this kind of work to different audiences, they would say, well, why don't you just emphasize both? Then you can make everybody happy. So the third advertisement that some people were randomly assigned to stated, we are offering a new program that will help you to save money and energy. By using less electricity, you can reduce your electricity bill and your environmental impact. And what we found is that the advertisement that emphasized environmental benefits was the most effective in motivating enrollment. So mentioning the monetary benefits of saving electricity, whether you mention it alone or in combination with the environmental benefits, had lower enrollment in the program than emphasizing the environmental benefits. And this was especially true among consumers who identified as pro-environmental, because presumably those are the consumers who feel most good about saving electricity and doing something for the environment. So the main message here is emphasize the environmental impacts of saving electricity if you want people to sign up for that. Right. So what I want to do next, I have a little bit of time left, is to talk a little bit about the methodology of those studies, because I've given you highlight findings or overview of our findings without talking much about how the methodology worked. The methodology is called the mental models methodology, and what it does is it aims to explicitly understand how the intended audience of a communication thinks about the topic at hand, to understand what motivates them, to understand how they view it and what their misinterpretations are, so that communications can focus specifically on those things that people misunderstand and those things that are barriers to behavior change, rather than just targeting everything and making a communication that is too overwhelming to process. A description of that methodology can be found in different places. So one book that I can recommend is the book by Granger Morgan and colleagues called Risk Communication, a Mental Models Approach. There's also, and that book is written mainly by engineers for engineers and includes topics such as climate change and energy. There's also a book that where Baruch Fishoff was the main author, that was written and published by the US Food and Drug Administration. And the nice thing about that one, it's available for free online, so you can download it. But I should tell you that the context of that book is mostly focused on health risks, although the recommendations are generally the same. And then I also have a video out on YouTube where you can watch me talk about how to develop communications in a meeting that was held for the National Academy of Sciences on the science of science communication. So I want to end with some simple take-home messages, just in case I was talking too much. And so those 5 take-home messages that I want to highlight from each of the examples I gave were to, if you want to develop effective communications, insights from psychology and behavioral science suggest that it's important to write in accessible wording that lay people will understand. I know as experts, it's often the case that we write in very we use big words because those words are very meaningful within our field, and we use those words to communicate to our colleagues. But communicating to your colleagues is not the same as communicating to lay audiences. So when writing for lay audiences, it's important to write in accessible wording. And lay audiences, of course, include sometimes practitioners and policymakers who may not be trained in your field, as well as your colleagues on interdisciplinary teams who don't have training in your field. So write in accessible wording, address the motivated majority. So climate communications tend to focus a lot on convincing the people who don't believe that climate change is happening. But since a majority is concerned about climate change now, but are not necessarily aware of how to tackle it, it's important to develop communications that focus on those people. Target local concerns about climate change. And so it may be different weather events that people are concerned about resulting from climate change in their area. Show a range of feasible alternatives rather than just pushing one. And emphasize what people care about. And that may be saving the environment rather than saving money. And then if that's too much to remember, I hope you will remember that it's important to learn who your audience is and to know their misunderstandings and barriers to behavior change that needs to be addressed in communications. And then finally, I'd like to highlight it's important to test your communications. And so because just because you followed these recommendations doesn't mean that your communications worked. So to see if your communications worked, you can do randomized controlled trials, randomly assigning people to your communications versus a standard communication, and then see if your communication achieves the goals that you had in mind, improving understanding, changing behavior. And psychologists can help with that. That's what we are trained in. We're not experts in climate change. I am certainly not, but I do know how to test what audiences believe and what motivates them, and how to test communications. So please do get in touch if you have any questions or ask them now. Thank you.
Fantastic, Wändi. Thank you so much. That was a great, rich, but also really useful presentation. As an old public communications teacher, whenever I ask folks, what are the first 3 rules about good communication? And the first 3 rules are always audience, audience, audience. And so thank you for reinforcing that. So we do have some questions in the Q&A, and I am delighted to move straight to those. So let's see, the first goes back to early in your talk. Could you speak to the utility of the term carbon footprint? I have come to learn that the term was pioneered by fossil fuel companies looking to place the focus of climate action on the individual rather than collective or regulatory action. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so like I said, we're testing a range of terms that are being used in climate communications. Carbon footprint actually is not part of it, but other terms that have carbon in them are. So, and what we're finding is that carbon already is a word that a lot of people don't necessarily recognize, and that actually CO2 is more recognizable to most general audience members. And then if I have to guess, I think that carbon footprint is, it's a little bit of a complicated term. It is being used more and more often. And so what you do find with complicated terms, that once they're being used more often, public understanding changes. But I must say, for mitigation, it's still not true that it's widely understood. And mitigation has been used for a very long time. So it might be a good idea. Maybe carbon footprint isn't the best way to express our use or our contribution to climate change.
Interesting. And what do people understand when you say that CO2 is more accessible? What do they understand that to mean?
It was not my intuition, but my intuition can be wrong, and then that's why we have to test with our audience members rather than just guess at it from sitting in our office or in this case on our couch. So I think people recognize that CO2 goes into the atmosphere and contributes to climate change more easily than that carbon is the thing that does that.
Okay. Thank you. Great. Okay, next question, also from Ian Hitchcock. What advice do you have to minimize the impact of climate despair among folks who are highly motivated to address climate change, but increasingly despairing or disengaging due to the overwhelming nature and acceleration of the climate crisis?
So research in psychology and risk communication have suggested that fear appeals, making people feel scared about a risk, is counterproductive and probably has led to climate despair. So we're all gonna die is not an effective communication and leads people to tune out. And the research on this topic suggests that if you want to motivate people, a little bit of fear, only moderate levels of fear are okay, but they have to be combined with things that people can do about it so that they feel in control and can do something to reduce the risk and reduce their fear. And so I think we have some work to do maybe in terms of explaining to people, pointing people to those things that they can do to contribute to curbing climate change, because they don't really know what to do.
Yeah, yeah, thank you. Do you advise, or could you advise perhaps, on how to counter the tendency of folks to focus only on the costs of transitioning to clean energy rather than the costs of inaction on climate, right? So if they're weighing those,
Can you
or
say
if
that again?
they're not weighing those. So how to counter the tendency of people to focus on the costs of transitioning to clean energy instead of we tend to focus on how much expensive it is to make a sustainable energy system, but we're not necessarily comparing it with the costs of not doing anything, right? So
Right.
how can we counteract that tendency to say, oh, it's going to be just billions of dollars and be too expensive for this, when actually it will do the same on the other side as well.
Yeah, you're right. And so I must say that it's not a topic that my research has looked at, but what you do see is there's a lot of tendency to use cost as the way to make arguments for or against options, and compare all options in terms of, if other options are compared, they are compared in terms of the costs and not the other benefits.
Right.
And so one response to that has been by some researchers, to calculate the costs of the other options.
Right.
But still, the emphasis remains on costs. And I wonder, because a lot of people seem to care about the environment, and that expressing what it means for the environment, the different options, might also be important.
Okay, so would you recommend in that situation sort of exiting out of the cost conversation and trying to say, you know, that's not the only value here that we need to look at? Or would you say, yeah, no, you got to show parity on the cost question, right, between the cost to do energy, but the cost of no action, you know, is just as bad.
Yeah.
Would you stay with that framing, or would you shift the frame?
Well, so I think it's an empirical question that I haven't seen the answer tested to, but you
Yeah.
can test it. You
Yeah.
can show options to people in those different ways and
Right.
see what resonates the most, and what people also find the most helpful in making their decisions.
New study idea. I like it. Okay, let's see. Next question. Have you, whoopsie, where did it go? Here it is. Have you considered using clean air, water, and public health instead of quote unquote environmental benefits? Is there a wide consensus on what environment means?
Yeah, good point. We haven't done that, and that might motivate people even more, especially now that it's becoming more and more of an issue.
Right, right. Where we can see the clean air impacts right now, in fact. Yeah. Okay, great.
So even when we use environmental benefits, which may not sound as motivating as clean air, it worked better than emphasizing the money.
Right, right. Okay. Question from Chris Snedden, who is head of our geography department here at Dartmouth. Are the lessons of climate communication universally applicable across very different cultural contexts? In other words, are the same strategies that might be effective in the US as effective in Vietnam or South Africa?
That is a good question, and it's very important that we start studying that, and I have not. My research has focused on the US and the UK mostly.
Okay.
And
okay.
so, I mean, understanding your audience and testing your communications are two pieces of advice that are going to be important no matter where you develop communications.
Right.
The specific issues that arise may be different, but the ones that I highlight today are very high-level general suggestions for communicating better. So in Vietnam or somewhere else, it's probably still going to be the case that experts have terminology that non-experts don't use, and that they should use simpler wording to
Right.
communicate if they want people to pay attention and understand the recommendations. But still, a lot of this work, not just by myself, but also by others, is focused on the global north.
Thank you. Okay, Eric Ostberg from our climate science program here asks, I'm concerned with the recent framing that, quote, we only have 10 years to act, unquote, on climate change before it is too late. I imagine that this sort of messaging might be effective to spur action, but I'm very concerned that this leads to the idea 10 years from now, right, that it's too late, so why do we do anything? What are your thoughts about
Right, or we
this?
still have 10 years, so why do something now?
Right, right.
Yeah, yeah. And so that is actually quite a common response. And one of the reasons, this is not what you asked, but one of the reasons for that is that a lot of people think about climate change as a form of air pollution. And with air pollution, you can stop the air pollution and you can see an effect in a couple of days. But with climate change, the CO2 emissions that go into the atmosphere will not be reduced by just stopping doing what we're doing for a couple of days. It's going to take much longer. And because of that, because people don't realize that, they think that, oh, we can just act when it gets bad. And so that is, I think there's two things we need to do. The focus on the importance of acting now, rather than giving people another 10 years, and or policymakers another 10 years, and explaining why that is, because a lot of people don't realize that it's CO2 it stays in the atmosphere much longer than air pollution.
Well, and it's really interesting too, isn't it, that that for some of us, the saying that we only have 10 years actually has a great sense of urgency, especially when you're working with geologic timeframes, right? Of
Yes.
change. And so 10 years feels like that's now, but for most people, 10 years
It's
is
not.
not, right? 10 years is far away, right?
In other contexts, we've done studies where we ask people for their household how long their long-term planning is, and it's usually a year, the longest. And a lot of households plan month to month. I know that's, uh, mostly because of financial
Yeah.
planning, but 10 years is a long time for most
Yeah.
people.
Well, so another piece of knowing your audience then may also just be, if you're looking for that, what can we do now question, right? Because
Yeah.
that the long term is a year from now, especially in these days when time has taken on a whole new meaning, right?
Yeah.
Or lost meaning or something for many of us. Then how do we respond to that differently than that time barrier? Thanks,
Yeah.
Eric, for that question. Okay, Thomas McHenry asks, have recent climate events, fire, flooding, break of ice sheets, etc., shown any appreciable change in the percentage of the receptive audience to these messages? And
Yeah.
have you been able to identify what triggered that change? Well, I mean, I think you noted the 73%, right? I mean, that's a fairly recent development, right? Over the last 5
Yes.
years or less.
Yes. Yes. And so generally people who have experienced extreme weather events tend to be more concerned about climate change, and that is true even that's true among Democrats and Republicans have traditionally not been as concerned as Democrats, but extreme weather events are making a change in what people are concerned about, and they're becoming more and more concerned.
Are you seeing, maybe it's too recent to ask this question, but have you seen any impact from the California fires, right? Are people making a connection between the intensity and size, and the change over time of, fire intensity over the past several years in the Pacific West? Have you seen anything that indicates that that's trickling in on that front as well?
Yeah, anecdotally, yes. Yeah. I haven't
Anecdotally, yeah.
specifically studied it, but yes.
Yeah, got it. Okay. A question from Sue Kaplan, straight and to the point. What is your perspective about whether effective communications can change behavior?
Oh, yes, they can. But a lot of communications don't change behavior. And that's because it's not necessarily that easy to do it right. It's like, just because you talk or write or make a video doesn't mean it will change people's minds. It really requires understanding what motivates people, what they need to change their behavior. And of course, it also helps if your audience is receptive. But the good news about climate change right now, good news, is that more and more people are concerned, and they don't know what to do, and a lot of them want to know what to do. So this is easy for communications. That is, you have an audience that wants to pay attention. So so then the work needs to go into, okay, what is it that people need to know? What is it that they can do and want to do? And how do we help them do it?
Thank you. Caroline Mahoney asks, in responding to the COVID-19 pandemic, much of the world has been able to make a sharp pivot to a new normal. Is it true that we can use similar rhetoric to inspire people to accept new permanent changes to make our lives today more sustainable? So can since we were forced to pivot and we pivoted because of COVID, is that an experience that might apply to sustainability or climate or energy?
Yeah, I think a difference with the pandemic has been that as compared to climate change communications, COVID was something that was happening now. And we all need to do something together to fix this. And I think those were two important elements of the communications about COVID, and that motivated people to stay home. And now also in the beginning that wasn't recommended, but wear masks. And because we needed to flatten the curve. So we saw that people were getting sick and dying. And so we saw the direct outcome, and we needed to do something about it. And so that immediacy, that togetherness, I think was what was helpful in the COVID-19 context, that is not necessarily used as much in the climate context. But in COVID-19, we're also seeing that it's getting harder to communicate well as the economy is being opened up, because as different businesses are allowed to open, it's harder, the communication becomes inconsistent, right? And it's harder for people to realize, what can I do? What can I not do? Maybe it's not that bad. And so that inconsistency, that perceived inconsistency, or maybe also actual consistency where some places allow it and other places don't, it makes people confused, it makes them angry, and makes them less likely to continue with a behavior that is already hard, because it's hard to stay at home and wear masks everywhere. But even there, I must say, the good news is that we're tracking people's behaviors in a nationally representative survey in the US. We've been doing that since March, and every 2 weeks people report on their behaviors and their mental health and their risk perceptions and so on. And if you look at mask use, I know the media have been paying a lot of attention to people who are not using masks and who are protesting it, but we're still seeing today that 90% of our respondents of this nationally representative sample are reporting mask use. Now, this is self-report, so we don't know whether they're using their mask correctly or all the time, but the majority is, at least on this survey, saying that they are still using that behavior.
Great, thank you. Tom Burak, our colleague, asks, your study on messaging relating to energy savings clearly suggests that, at least in the short term, the best results come from emphasizing only their environmental benefits. But what about in the longer term, 6 months, 12 months, 5 to 10 years? Do you build credibility, more engagement, especially with those who are not intrinsically motivated, if parties see that in fact they can save money over the long term? So to sum up, he says, don't we need to look at short, medium, and long-term behavior changes, engaging the effectiveness of different messaging?
Yes, we should. And that's basically a limitation of almost all the work I've shown. So a lot of research funding is for one-shot communications and not to track what happens over time. With our COVID survey being an exception. And so we don't know whether what works in the short run works as well in the long run. And it would be important to know. Now, with the case of energy savings, we did ask people about whether they're aware that saving energy saves money, and they're aware. It's not that they're not aware, it's just that when you emphasize it, it demotivated most consumers, especially people who identified as green and pro-environmental. So over time, if that research holds in the long run, maybe over time showing that how much you've saved the environment or how much you've saved CO2 emissions might be better than showing how much you've saved money. But I don't know, it might be.
Thank you. Yeah, no, it's longitudinal studies are really important and really expensive.
Yes.
Yes. And hard to get done. Yeah. Let's see. The questions are still coming. Thank you so much, folks. This is great. Sue Kaplan asks another. Have you considered how to talk about exponential growth in a way that the 6th to 8th grade level reader can understand? I'm thinking of the warming is thawing the permafrost. Exponential growth. How do we talk about that in a, how do we translate that?
Yeah, good question. I will need members of the intended audience to test the idea with and to test existing communications with to see what sticks and what doesn't. But my guess is that graphs might be helpful. Now, that's often an intuition that graphs will be helpful, but
Right.
a lot of graphs are actually not helpful, and a lot of climate graphs are way too difficult for non-experts to understand. They're very beautiful graphs with lots of colors, but the more information you squeeze into a graph, the harder it is for non-expert audiences to understand. So a simple graph with a main message, and I think exponential growth could be a simple graph. I mean, it's a complex concept, but it could be reflected in a relatively simple graph that doesn't have too much going on. So, and then explaining what the graph shows might be the way to go. But again, we should test that. Don't trust just because I said it, it will work.
Well, but it's a really interesting and useful, sort of global comment. And it's not just the words that you use. It's also, I mean, we communicate in many other ways besides text, right? And so if you have an image, right, it's easy for us to see, an image that has, in the academy that has, something on this x-axis and something on this, or is that y-axis? Yeah, multiple axes, right, that are labeled with different values, right? But that takes a lot to unpack and digest. And so the point is, don't use a lot of them, and make the ones that you do use, clear and simple and straightforward, so that the message can have the impact.
Yeah. So I actually tested visualizations that are being used in climate communication, specifically ones that we took from the Met Office UK climate projection report, and those are graphs that show for different models projections of rainfall at different probability levels, a lot of different things that made it very hard for people to understand what the main message was. And so, yeah.
Good advice. Mark Perino asks, whoopsie, this question there it is. Has your or any other research indicated if attributing specific extreme weather events to climate change is an effective mode of communicating the problem? Does it distract from the main issue, i.e. people arguing over specific events as opposed to larger trends, or might it help people see the imminent dangers?
I think that people are making these links. Most people are making these links, and it's contributing to their concern. There is a minority that will question climate communications, whether events are attributable to climate change, but that is actually a minority that I think a lot of climate communicators have tried to focus on to convince them. But I think for most people, extreme events lead to increased climate concern, even if climate scientists are very careful about attributing specific events to climate change. I realize that.
Right. Okay, and one more question from Ian Hitchcock. It strikes me that in conversations about COVID and climate, we've seen wildly different responses based on people's political or partisan identity.
Yes.
What lessons about communicating risk that we've seen from the COVID crisis do you think could be applied to climate work, particularly given what we've observed about the fragmented ways in which people receive communications and filter them through tribal identities? Good question.
Yes, I just wrote a paper that is about to come out in the Journal of Risk and Uncertainty on this topic for COVID, though. Yeah, and so what we see in our COVID survey is that people who identify as Democratic voters report more. I don't remember the exact numbers, but if people want to write me, I'll send the paper because it's not online yet, but it has been accepted. People who identify as Democrat report more social distancing and more mask use than people who identify as Republican, and with independent and third-party voters in between. But those differences, and they also disagree a lot on whether states should be reopening. But where they not differ so much is hand washing and canceling travel. And so, which are the things that have been less focused on in the politicized messaging, right? And so I think that and those differences between Democrats and Republicans is not actually explained by their media use. They use very much different media sources. There's a big difference in the media they follow on COVID-19, but that doesn't actually fully explain their differences in implementing protective behaviors, specifically social distancing and mask use. And so that suggests that there's something deeper going on, and it's probably partly related to their political beliefs, where Democrats tend to support public health initiatives to promote better health, and Republicans think that that's personal responsibility, and also differences perhaps in concerns about the economy. But research on other topics has suggested that you can bring people together, by focusing messages on what unites them, that we need to get through this as a country, that there are perhaps people dying that we care about, or you can find, it's often possible to find topics that everyone cares about, and focusing on those topics can unite people. And I think that in the United States, that's currently not happening. And so people are divided by the messages rather than united.
In 30 seconds, any lessons from that you would translate over to the climate space?
I think with climate also, we can focus on things that we all can. Breathable air, probably something that we all enjoy. Health of our children tend to be topics that everyone cares about. And so that might be concerns that unites people, and then focusing on what we all can do together to make those outcomes happen would probably be good.
Thank you so much. And thank you to everyone for having wonderful questions. This is a really fun discussion, Wändi. I really appreciate you being with us today. And hopefully we've given you a couple of seeds for other possible questions to pursue in your work in the days and years ahead. Thank you so very much for being with us, Wändi. I'm going to pivot now to a couple of slides. Steph, can you pull them up to show folks what's coming up from the Irving Institute? So tonight is our second session in our Fall 2020 Energy 101 series. If you want to join us, you can still go ahead and register, go to our website and find the link. Tonight we will focus on the roles that energy plays in our lives today, and in some cases, help with that question of what to do, right, to reduce your own personal energy use. And then to the next slide, Stephanie, please, our other upcoming energy events. Our new Energy Conversations series continues next week with, it is next week, isn't it? Yes, it is. Next week with two of our graduate students from Thayer, focusing on interdependent energy infrastructure systems. On Tuesday, October 13, so 2 weeks from today, we will host Jenny Stevens from Northeastern University, who is on a book tour for her new book, Diversifying Power, Why We Need Anti-Racist Feminist Leadership on Climate and Energy. And then the New Energy series again, Diana Hernandez on October 21, looking at energy and poverty. And then back to our Energy Collaborative series, another speaker on policy and racism and justice in the United States in this context of our pending national elections. So once more, a real hearty thank you, Wändi, for spending some time with us today. And we hope we'll see you again soon. Everyone who's out there, stay safe, stay well, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.